Well, welcome everybody. What a great crowd we've got here today. Today's talk is Uninnocent Landscapes, following George Augustus Robinson, with Senior Curator of Cultural Heritage at TMAG, Ian Terry. Now, today's talk has been broadcast as a webinar, and we're pleased to welcome those people who are also joining us online today. In due course, the talk will be available on Libraries Tasmania's SoundCloud and on Libraries Tasmania's YouTube channel. Now, if you haven't already done so, please switch off your phones now. And Ian will take questions at the end of his talk. Now, before I introduce Ian, I'd like to read to you Library Tasmania's acknowledgement of Tasmania's Aboriginal peoples. Libraries Tasmania recognises the deep histories and cultures of the Aboriginal people of Lutruwita, Tasmania. We acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of the land, waters and sky. We pay respect to the elders past and present who hold the memories, traditions, culture and knowledge of country. And we extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose countries were never ceded. Now, Ian has worked as an outdoor tour guide, a heritage officer at the Parks and Wildlife Service, a freelance historian and a heritage consultant, and most recently, Senior Curator of Cultural Heritage at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. Among the many exhibitions he curated at the museum was Our Land, Parawa, Go Away, which examined the history of frontier conflict in Tasmania. Ian is holding an exhibition on his Uninnocent landscape projects at the Side Space Gallery on the 2nd to the 3rd of November, and will be launching a book at the same time. Now, please join me in welcoming Ian.
Thank you very much, Liz. Can everyone hear okay at the back there? Excellent. If you have any trouble, just jump up and down and scream or whatever. Firstly, I'd also feel the need to acknowledge the Aboriginal people of Tasmania, of Pallaru Lutruwita. This project is really looking at my response as a non-Indigenous Tasmanian, or someone who's been here for 40 years, to the impact of colonisation, invasion, dispossession on our landscape in this beautiful island, and what it means to me as a non-Indigenous person living here for that. First, I need to say that Eleanor is a Senior Curator of Cultural Heritage at TMAG, not me. I retired nearly 6 years ago. And the exhibition, I must have set the wrong dates too, there's the exhibitions from the 2nd of November to the 13th of November. Okay, so this project, I really started thinking about 10 years ago when I was doing the curating with Tony Brown, the Indigenous Cultures Curator, the Para exhibition, and thinking about George Augustus Robinson. And I've always loved bushwalking. I've been keen on photography for many, many years. So I thought when I retired, what a nice project it would be to go out in the bush, be able to do my outdoor sort of things, combine it with my love of history and my sort of increasing knowledge of Tasmanian history, and create some kind of photographic project. So that's where it all started. Here we go. So one of the, as I said, part of the idea behind this whole project is for me to come to terms with my place in Tasmania. As I said, I've been here 40 years. From the day I arrived here, I knew I was home. This is a beautiful place. I love walking all over the state. But it's also always in the back of my head is that realisation that my great good fortune in enjoying my life here came at a cost, and a cost to Tasmania's Pallaru people, Lutruwita's Pallaru people. Chelsea Wattego, who's our Indigenous woman from Brisbane and is a pretty fierce person, wrote this in a book she published a couple of years ago. And I think this sort of encapsulates what I'm doing in this particular project, trying to work out whose land I'm walking on and just considering it as I go along. I was also very taken with a conversation by a British landscape writer, Robert Macfarlane, that he had with American landscape writer, the late Barry Lopez, in 2019. And Robert wrote a book called Underland, which is about environmental history or history of underground, the world underground. And he's talking about these caves in Slovenia, which had a really dark history in the 20th century, in the First World War, Civil War after, then the Second World War. And he talked about the uninnocence of landscapes and the memories they carried, the traces they record, and archive histories, dark and light. So I guess that really resonated with me for this project. So the project, of course, starts with this man here, George Augustus Robinson. He was a London builder who came from working class London, came to Van Diemen's Land in 1824. He was 32 years old, quickly set up a building business and became a successful builder in Hobart. Also very quickly got himself into the evangelical, humanitarian sort of group of people in Hobart. And 1829, he was appointed by Governor Arthur as at the Flinders Island Aboriginal mission, so to speak. I've forgotten the exact name of it. And then at the end of 1829, he suggested to Arthur that it would be a good thing. Now, remember, in 1829, we've had the Black War going for 5 years. So there's been a lot of violence in Tasmania for the last 5 years, increasing violence. He said, what if I take some of my Aboriginal friends here from Flinders Island as guides and envoys, and they can guide me walking around the island, initially around to the southwest of Port Davey, and I will contact Palawa who are living on country and persuade them to stop fighting, okay, so that we can end all this violence. So this project of his went on for 5 years, or 4 or 5 years, and the Big River Mission, which started on the 15th of October 1831 and finished on New Year's Eve 1831, it was probably the most significant of those missions, and it's regarded by most historians as being the thing that ended the Black War, ended the violence, as he ended up meeting with the last 26 survivors of the Big River and Oyster Bay people, who are some of the key protagonists in the fighting, and persuaded them to come down to Hobart and meet with Governor Arthur to negotiate a settlement. So this is 1830 Van Diemen's Land, and that's roughly the area that George Augustus Robinson and his envoys were walking in over that 2.5-month period. There's a bit of a more detailed map showing roughly their route, and the red dots there are roughly where the photographs that you will see in this presentation were taken. So he left Campbelltown on the 15th of October. He had 13 Palawa guides and envoys, as I said, and there's a number of them there. And I'm not sure if that's the full group that were with him on that particular occasion, but there's a number of those people were with him at that time. That's a John Glover sketch. And that's the names of the folk who were with him. Now, he couldn't have survived, or couldn't have actually done any of this without these people. The Aboriginal guides and envoys were really the people who made the so-called friendly mission possible. They guided him, they showed him the way, they fed him, they acted as interlocutors between Aboriginal people they met and himself. They also frustrated him, as we'll see. Okay, so he came down from Launceston on the 9th of October and spent a week in Campbelltown before the start of the mission. This isn't actually where the Palawa people were camped. Robinson himself stayed in a hotel, Broad's Inn, on the northern side of the river here. It's now a private residence. It's actually a street to the west of the main of the Midlands Highway now. And he records that his Aboriginal guides camped on the other side of the river. Now, the river has been redirected since that time, so it's a bit further east from here. The 15th, after a week in Campbelltown on the 15th, he left, going roughly on what's the Lake Leak Road, heading east, which his guides told him was the traditional Aboriginal route to the east coast. And his first night, he camped somewhere around here, just as the road rises on the Lake Leak Road. Spent a night on the tier, the hills near a stream of water. He also comments in his journal at this time that Umara, who is one of his envoys, told him that just near here, Umara had been here a couple of years earlier, had been attacked by some white people, and the two of the group that he was in had been killed at this or near this spot. So he continues on. So basically what this talk is going to be is it's going to be a chronological landscape journey that will go on, and we can see, I think, well, the intention of this whole project is to see what the impact of colonisation has been and dispossession has been on the landscape. So he keeps going, it sort of starts turning south from the Lake Leak Highway. A few kilometres west of Lake Leak, he turns south along the western edge of the eastern tiers. And he talks about this country frequently throughout the whole journey. He talks about this country being very adapted for the Aboriginal people, for the natives, as he says, consisting of thickly wooded hills and small open plains. And this area on the property called Windfalls, up on the Lake Leak Road, is very much like this. And he actually went right through the middle of this. And a lot of the plateaus this way. So part of the landscape was formed this way because of environmental factors with frost hollows and dampness, but also a lot of it has been formed through Aboriginal burning over the millennia. It's actually a really beautiful landscape. So this project gave me the opportunity to go to a lot of country that normally most people can't go to. I spent a lot of time on farms and private property, so I had a lot of assistance from quite a number of property owners in Tasmania who let me walk through, camp on their land and take photographs. So he talks about just south of here, going through an area with the local people called Pieretta. So again, I've got this image. The farmer there has called this paddock McCarthy's. So it's overlaying the original Indigenous name of the land of this place with the farmers, and all the paddocks on this farm have a different name. Okay. As he heads further south, he crosses the Macquarie River, and Glen Morrison Rivulet first actually, and he talks about the dense forest. In fact, the Black Line, which happened in late 1830, went through here a year before Robinson, and he's always, because he thought the Black Line was a complete waste of time, because it wasn't what he was wanting to do, of course, so he had his own agenda there. But he's also talking about, this thick bush, this rugged landscape, these craggy mountains. The whole project of the Black Line was a farce and ridiculous. But as we see today, this area which he talked about, a forested area, is now being, is quite deforested in parts. A couple of days later, he crosses the Macquarie River near the Tombs Lake Road, south of Ross. And serendipitously, when Erica over here, and Erica spent a fair bit of time with me on this project, going to various places. When we came here one day, the farmer, Hamish Hollis, was actually doing his autumn burn-offs in this place. And Robinson talks about white farms burning off in this place. So there's a lot of serendipity in my project in coming to places in similar kinds of environmental conditions. So after he crossed the Macquarie River, he went west of Tombs Lake and into an area called the Eastern Marshes. Now, what he's trying to do most of the time, between what's now the Lake Leak Road and Tombs Lake, he was actually not seeing. It was pretty wild country there. There were not really farms there. He was in the bush, so he wasn't really seeing anyone. Once they get to the Eastern Marshes by 1831, there are quite a lot of people, farmers or stock keepers out there, and so he's trying to dodge around, not be seen by the various farmers, because he didn't want his Palawa guides to be attacked. He gets to Hobbs Lagoon, part of the big lagoon, southeast of Oatlands, and I mean, when Eric and I were there, it was just absolutely beautiful sunny day there, this fantastic landscape. But he talks about the Palawa usage of the land, that this was a favourite resort again of the Palawa people, and that there was an abundance of eels in the lagoon, so that would have been a fantastic food source for the Aboriginal people. After wandering around that area for a few days, he heads back west. So what's going on in this whole project is that, as I said earlier, he is very, very reliant on his Palawa guides. Now, they're smart people, of course, and they understand very clearly what Robinson's on about, which is trying to contact the last Aboriginal people, last warriors fighting, and bring them in. And they're with him, they're safe, they're on country, not their own country. I don't think any of them were from this particular area, but they're out in the bush. They can hunt as much as they like. And because they're with a white man, they're actually fairly safe generally. So they're wanting to extend this whole project as much as they can. And they'd be saying, oh, they've gone that way. No, they've gone that way. And they do this day after day after day. Or they say, well, we can't go yet because we need to go hunting. We haven't got enough kangaroos. And doing this day, and Robinson himself becomes very, very frustrated. He knows exactly what the score is. He knows that he is deeply, deeply dependent on these people. And they have, even though theoretically he's in charge, he keeps saying to them, well, the governor wouldn't be happy, you know. And they say back to him, no, the governor wouldn't be happy with you, you know. So, you know. And he says after one of these exchanges, he says, oh, Manalagena, who is the main of the Palawa guides, he says he is a very shrewd man. So he knows exactly what's going on, but he can't do anything about it because he is completely dependent on them. So he ends up at Oatlands, just south of Oatlands. In fact, Kikatapola guides them to the outskirts of Oatlands, and he's really cross with Kikatapola about that, because he says, we don't want to go to towns. That's not what this is about. We need to be away from towns. What have you taken me here for? And so then they camp at a small lagoon, 1.5 kilometres south of Oatlands, which doesn't exist anymore. And I think, well, Erica and I thought it was possibly the race course, which is this flat area. It's not marked as a lagoon at that time, but there's nothing else in that area that we could see where there might have been a lagoon. Anyway, they camp there at night, and he goes through a short wander in the afternoon, and again his Palawa guides take him to the site where there's this a skull with a bullet hole in it, and so he surmises, and they talk about how there'd been an attack on Palawa people in that area. So he surmises that this is the skull of one of those people who'd been killed there. From Oatlands, he heads over towards the Jordan River, sort of north of Jericho. Yep, area called Lower Marshes, and he then climbs up the tier to just north of Bothwell, and he says he gets on a viewpoint high up, and he looks down at this beautiful landscape with all these farms around. Now, that's not what he saw. They didn't have centre pivot irrigators in 1830, as far as I'm aware. Someone with agricultural historic knowledge might be able to correct me on that, but I don't think they did. Clearly, this isn't a photo I took either. This is just taken from Google Maps. He heads north of Bothwell across the Clyde River to Cluny, where Captain Clark's property was. Again, he suddenly comes over a hill because he doesn't want to contact people. except when he needs to, because he needs to get supplies every now and again. Comes over a hill, and all of a sudden he realises he's about 200 metres from Captain Clark's Cluny property. So he goes and stays with Captain Clark. And then the next day he's walking out towards the Shannon River, the Hermitage, and he goes through Weasel Plains, which is this area here. And he talks about, we're starting to get farming here now. He's starting to see sheep around the place, and then deforestation as well, the land clearing. He comes to the Hermitage, Dr. Ross's property, crosses the river, the Shannon River, and then heads towards the Ouse River, or the Big River, hence the Big River Mission, and goes over this high tier, which he talks about the scenery being very fine, as you can see, the whole of the hills to their summit, covered with herbage, thinly wooded, and in many parts it's clear of trees. Well, it's still very thinly wooded, and a lot of the trees up there are dying, as you can see. The property is lots of thistles. There's thistles there in the foreground. But he talks also about there being, look south to these snowy mountains to the south. And when you're up there, you're looking straight down to Mount Field West, the Mount Field Range. And so, it's really exciting when you're doing these walks, because I'm following Plomley's journal and the maps that Plomley made in 1966 of mapping his journey. And then when I've taken his journal with me, and when you come to these places and you see, okay, yes, this is where he was. He was here, because he's describing what I can see at that place. So then he goes down to camp on the Big River, or the Ouse River, and he talks about this being a very, very romantic place. It's a beautiful scenery, and it is. It's very lovely. It's a little stream that goes in down a valley between high grassy hills on either side, with a bit of forest on either side. But he's also told of a really awful event that had happened there a few years earlier, the killing of Boomer Jack, a Bruny Island man, who was acting as a guide for one of Arthur's roving parties. The soldiers there, so this story is told to him by some of the Bruny Island guides envoys who were with him. Boomer Jack and Nelson, his wife, were from Bruny Island, and they tell him this story about how the soldiers were basically raping his wife, Nelson, and he didn't like that, strangely enough, and he tries to escape them and jumps into the river, and they keep shooting every time he comes up until they finally shoot him and kill him. Shot him through the head. Nelson escaped and went back to Bruny Island and told the story to her family on Bruny Island and Boomer Jack's family. And Robinson makes a comment that some of her relatives and some of his relatives were with him as guides at this particular place, and that, of course, they were very upset being at this place. They climb up out of the Ouse River, up onto the Bashan Plains, and once again we have a little shooting story where John Espy was the landowner there. Edward Lord had land there before. There was an old hut of Edward Lord's up there, but now it was John Espy. And he's told about how a few years ago, 1828 I think it was, there'd been some Aboriginal people had actually raided one of these stock keepers' huts there, and then they came back, and one of the Aboriginal people was shot and killed, and the body was placed in a tree near where they are. So this is up near the Cattle Hill Wind Farm, if anybody is familiar with this part of the country. Then he heads over towards Lake Echo, Lunya, which is the Palawa name for it. Goes around the northern end of Lake Echo, and then walks down the western side. And he says, on ascending a small eminence, I came abruptly to Lake Echo, such an expanse of water I had not seen before in the colony as a lake. The whole surface is clear, 30 miles in circumference, the banks deep and well wooded all round. And he also says, extending this quote, which I haven't put on the screen there, he talks about it being, again, a truly romantic scene, which would be well worth a visit for the gentleman to come and see this beautiful place. From Lake Echo, he heads further south past what we now know as the London Lakes towards Bronte Lagoon, which is in the background there, to this land, which again talks about how this is a landscape that has been created by Aboriginal people, by Aboriginal land management practices, by burning over millennia. And it's just the most, it's the sort of landscape you read early explorers talking about walking through a gentleman or coming through a gentleman's parkland. You get that frequently on mainland Australia and also in Tasmania, and this is exactly what we have here. And as Bruce Jones talked about the fire stick farming back in the 1960s, and Bill Gamage in his book a number of years ago also talks about this creation of an estate of an Aboriginal landscape. This is on the same property, but he heads bush sort of further south into quite thick, wet country and rugged country from this particular property. And he's frequently finding Aboriginal huts, little villages, with where people have been very recently, within the last few days. Now he's heading down towards the Ouse area. Coming to some fertile and grassy hills. It's quite, would have been probably a lot more forested, wooded in that time. And it goes to the north of or west of Ouse, and it comes down to the Diemen River. Roughly somewhere between here, which is the Repulse Dam, southwest of Ouse or west of Ouse, and the Catagunya Dam, which is a bit further upstream, a few kilometres upstream. And he camps on the banks of the Diemen River, and he waxes lyrical about how beautiful the river is. And he's talking about his camp near the Diemen Falls. Now, the Diemen Falls is now under the Repulse impoundment. The river's certainly not flowing, it's flowing a bit below the dam here. They also find a thylacine den in this area. He talks about finding a thylacine den, and not now. The beautiful stream is not gliding swiftly along in that particular point anymore. So as I said a bit earlier, he's always wary about trying to avoid stock keepers and any white stock keepers and white farmers and white men. And as he sees it, these white men are always on the lookout. The whole landscape is constantly under surveillance. And he heads back to Lake Echo. Lake Echo is a place he comes to quite frequently. So he gets there 3 times in this 2.5-month journey. And in fact, he eventually contacts the last of the Big River and Oyster Bay people about just a few kilometres west of Lake Echo. So he hits the southern end of Lake Echo, and then he walks along the eastern side of Lake Echo up to 3 Mile Marsh, which is at the northern end, camps there for a couple of days. The weather turns really wild, and eventually he's able to cross the Ouse River. There's still the upper Ouse River now, on the 2nd of November. The river, there's been a lot of rain, the river has come down a little bit, and he's managed to cross by leaping from rock to rock across the river because it's so swollen. This is the Montpiliata Canal, which goes from near Little Pine Lagoon to Lake Echo. And so Lake Echo is there's a power station at the southern end of Lake Echo. And then 2 days after that, he comes up to the Great Lake, Yingana Great Lake. And he couldn't help remarking on the goodness of Providence in the weather, because it finally cleared up. And then he went on his journey to Great Lake. And very close to the Great Lake, he finds groves of cider gums, the mellifluent cider gums, cider tree. Now he talks about finding groves of cider gums very, very frequently on the Central Plateau, around Lake Echo, around Arthur's Lake, talking about all the time. His Aboriginal guides tell him how they harvested the tree. In this particular quote here, actually further on, I didn't have room to put it here, how they would make incisions in the bark and let the sap run down through this sort of channel to a cup that they created at the base of the tree. He also talks about how possums and cockatoos would come to the tree to get the sap as well, and even ants. He said there'd be lots of ants around the trees. Now, sadly, cider gums now are really critically endangered, largely due to climate change. That's browsing pressure, but largely climate change. They need very cold winters to regenerate. This grove here, which you might be familiar with, is just east of Myena. After you leave the Myena Dam, you go up the hill there, it's on the right-hand side. 30 years ago, these trees were all living. Now they're very definitely not living. He goes to Arthur's Lake. Arthur's Lakes, as it was then, because there was more than one lake, before the hydro dammed the southern end in the Lake River in the 1950s. Again, serendipity. He talks about there being strong westerly winds with rain and snow. When I went there were strong westerly winds with rain and snow. He also talks about it being a very romantic scene again. He's always talking about these romantic scenes. Well, as you can see, this part of it isn't particularly romantic at the moment. And he talks about the swans and the ducks swimming on the lake itself and cormorants flying overhead. Now, as I said, he gets very frustrated. So he camps a night on Arthur's Lake, on the western side of the Arthur's Lakes, and he has a moment. He has a moment where he's got so frustrated with the way people have taken, his guides are just taking him all over the countryside, and he starts to remonstrate with them, and then he realises, that's not going to help, is it? If I get stuck into them, and talks about how they appeared utterly indifferent to his remonstrations with them, and what was worse, they had this grin of satisfaction. I just love this because it just shows. Robinson has been portrayed by some people as this person who had this somehow miraculous power over his Aboriginal guides, and that they were mesmerised by him, and that they were his willing pawns. But when you read the journal, that's not what is happening at all. They are the ones in the power. I mean, ultimately, I guess he is the one who, has the ultimate power. But during the whole journey, they're the ones who are really deciding what is going to happen every day. So from Arthur's Lake, he goes down the Lake River and comes down to an area called Regent's Plains on the Upper Lake River, in this area just here, which is now part of the property called Connerville. Back then it was Captain Clark's. Captain Clark had a property called Denniston, just north of Bothwell, but also had land at Regent's Plains. And it is an absolutely beautiful place, and the current landowner there is actually he's grazing, but he's also trying to manage this area for its native vegetation, so there's lots of native grasses still there. You'll see in a couple of images of kangaroo grass. It was probably a similar afternoon that we were there to 190 years earlier that Robinson was there. And they go down the Lake River and cross the river, middle deep, and then they go down through the pass and walk along the base of the Great Western Tiers. And he talks about a succession of grassy hills with kangaroo grass there, the themata. So that is still quite prevalent in those areas. Head further east past, it's called Western Marsh, where there's no marsh there now, up into the hills past Liffey, up the Liffey River, or Pennyroyal Creek as it was called then, and then up towards Quamby Bluff, and they camp below Quamby Bluff, and then they have to start climbing up the hills again, up the mountains, up the rocks up to the Central Plateau, and it's pretty wild weather. He talks when you're going along here, what good land this is for Aboriginal warriors who are fighting the invasion, because they know the country so well. They're at the base of the tiers. There's lots of farms in this area, and they can raid a hut and they can just go straight back up into the tier, into this country they know so well, really rugged country that they're not going to be followed into. And they climb up near what we now call Liffey Bluff, to ascend the mountain. It's a pretty wild day, very rocky, one massive fragments of rocks, so that we had to step and hop from one to the other until we reached the summit. And then they're up near the northern end of Great Lake, and they go back to Arthur's Lake, where, golly gosh, it's snowing again. So much so they can barely see the lake. This is up the northern end of Arthur's Lake now. They've come over they've crossed over what we now have as a Poatina Road, over the Sandbanks Tier, down Tumbledown Creek to Arthur's Lake. And from Arthur's Lake, he goes further south to the Lagoon of Islands, which, has always been a very extraordinary place. He talks about these, looks like this graveyard with these gravestones for these floating islands. Now, again, the river there was dammed in the 1950s, not for hydro purposes so much, but for irrigation. And it basically destroyed the wetlands and the ecology of the Lagoon of Islands. But in the last 10 or 15 years, so all these floating islands, which are basically reed mats, had disappeared. But in the last, about 10 or 15 years ago, the hydro who were managing it, they removed the dam, and they've got this rehabilitation program going on at the Lagoon of Islands, and slowly these reed mats are starting to reappear again. So there is hope. The thick wood as they go westward from the Lagoon of Islands, and eventually ends up at Crescent Lake, Lake Crescent, and the mouth of the Clyde River. So if anyone who knows their Tasmanian geography can probably understand that they're going all over the place. They're zigzagging everywhere. There's no straight line happening here. They are going all over, and this is all because his guides, his envoys are saying, they're over there, we've got to go this way, they've gone to the east. No, they've gone north now. Oh, they've gone south. So this is what's going on. And he camps near Lake Sorrel, near Captain Kemp's, or Kemp's, not Captain, but Kemp's hut. Lake Sorrel is a lake north of Lake Crescent. They head back west over the Almatia, this really rocky sort of country, open stringy bark forest and rocky country. And they get back, he gets back to the Lagoon of Islands again. Oh, it's going well for time. Lagoon of Islands, again, where this photograph's taken, the Lagoon of Islands is down below me on the right-hand side, about 300 metres away. And, I love this photo because he talks about the Big River woman, the woman from the Big River tribe, Wille Topaneer, said this was called the Luketa Makamamenya. This was an Aboriginal route. And now, of course, there's a road sign there saying private road. So, a lot of these roads, like the Lake Leak Highway, followed an Aboriginal route. This track, this road, Farm Road, follows an Aboriginal route. But they weren't private. Well, they were sort of private roads then for the mobs that had access to those lands, but much less private than today. And then he talks as they go back up to the Bashan Plains, over some high, rocky and woody hills about which the kangaroo was browsing in great numbers. Well, that's what I saw when I went there. Right in the background, to the right of those trees, you might or might not be able to see, you can see some of the windmills of the Cattle Hill wind farm. So he goes to Lake Echo, they go to Lake Echo and the northern end again, and then they cross an area which is now called Top Marsh, crossed over a high rocky tier of about 5 miles and arrived at some extensive open plains that reached to the west side of the Great Lake. So just over that small rise in the distance there, goes for quite a way and then comes down to the southern end of Little Pine Lake, what's it called? Little Pine Lake, Little Pine Lagoon, I can't remember. Anyway, so this is really, look, we've got the 30th of December here. He is really getting, like that day, he thought, oh, we've seen them, I've seen them, I can see smoke. And he sends people off to find them and he goes looking, and nothing happens and he gets very frustrated. Then Kikatapola comes back to him and says, we've seen them over the hills over there. So he starts to get excited. And the next morning he gets up very early, they get up very early, and he goes looking for the Big River and Oyster Bay people. Now, we don't know exactly where they went. Plumley's map just kind of goes into this area which, nobody really knows where he went. He talks about it being about 30 miles north of the peak of Tenerife, which is what we now know as Wilds Craig. But he also, near Platform Bluff, which is in this area as well, near Platform Bluff. But, he's obviously often pointing out features which he's got them wrong. They're not exactly where he thinks he is, which is very common at that time. Remember, they didn't have the 1 to 25,000 maps that I was using when I was doing this particular journey. So, finally that day, on the next day, the 31st of December, 1831, New Year's Eve, I finally saw the natives 100 yards away. Now, he, of course, talks this up. He says that Manalaganna and Kikatapola and his mob were absolutely terrified of the fierce Big River and Oyster Bay people, and quite possibly they were. I think, they were not, as we know, different Aboriginal bands and mobs and tribes, were at enmity with each other. But really, he's just talking himself up, saying, well, I bravely marched into the middle of them. They shook their spears at me, but I just looked at them and shook hands with them and told them that the governor, if they came and negotiated with the governor, basically the deal was going to be, and Tony can talk about this, the deal was going to be that if they stopped fighting and left their land, they would be able to go to another part of Tasmania with a good white man to look after them, and they would be able to return to their country at some stage in the future. That was what he was offering them. That was the deal that Robinson talks frequently to Manalaganna and co, that this is what was on offer. Now, when he meets these people, there's 26 people left. There's 16 men, 9 women and a baby. So basically, they've seen the writing on the wall. They've seen the writing on the wall. They know that they actually can't sustain this resistance anymore. That basically, they've got no hope now. So they think, okay, this guy, he's been chasing us around the countryside for so long. Maybe our best bet is to go and talk to the governor and see what we can deal with. Now, this has often been talked about as Robinson capturing. A lot of people talk about Robinson capturing these last of the Aboriginal people. But he himself doesn't use that word. He says these people cannot be seen as being captives. They say to him, the chiefs assigned as a reason for their outrages, that they and their forefathers had been cruelly abused, that their country had been taken from them, their wives and daughters had been violated and taken away, and that they had experienced a multitude of wrongs from a variety of sources. But they were willing to come under his protection in the terms I've just been talking about and talk to the government. So they head back down to Bothwell, where Alexander Reid, and you can read this in the Clyde River papers, talks about them having a corroboree outside the Castle Hotel, what's now the Castle Hotel, the Bothwell Inn. I think it was, the 4th of January, on the night of the 4th of January. They continue on down over the Den Hill, and they arrive back in Hobart on the 7th of January. And a week later, the newspapers talk about this on Saturday last, 26 Aborigines captured by Mr. Robinson, marched into town. 40 of them altogether, with the 14 who at that stage were with the tame mob, who were with Robinson. Now, this is what I think is, you know, they talk about that Robinson captured them, but here they are going down Elizabeth Street, arrayed in battle order, carrying their spears and shaking their spears. Now, if you're capturing people who are fighting against you, you're not going to let them, you're going to disarm them. You're not going to let them walk down the middle of the road with crowds on either side holding their spears and shaking their spears. So they are coming to negotiate, and they go to Government House and negotiate with Governor Arthur, and then 10 days later they're packed on a boat and sent up to Flinders Island, where most of them, where basically none of them ever got to see their country again. Thank you. So we've got 10 minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. No? Okay, let's go. Yes?
Speak a little bit about the time in January.
So
the question was hosted by
the question is, could I talk about when part of his missions he went to Great Swanport. This wasn't part of this project, that wasn't part of the Big River mission, so I haven't really looked into that. There is one of the, I'm not sure if it's the same journey because he went through that area a couple of times. He's at Grindstone Bay, which is a bit south of Swanport, at one stage, and he's told them, Kikatapola tells him about the killings of Mamoa, and I've forgotten who was a Tahitian convict, and another, I can't remember, there was Jack Redford. Was it Jack? No, Jack was a guy who was, anyway, another convict in 1823. And this incident is regarded as what started the violent conflict, the Black War, where there were stock keepers there on the banks of the river, the creek. Aboriginal people came down, and look, these sort of things happened all the time. And they'd camp nearby. Stock keepers, they knew they had to play this game really carefully. So there'd often be exchange. They'd give them some food or tobacco or whatever, and hopefully things would be okay and people would go away. Well, the story that Kikatapola tells is that one of the convicts shot one of the women, the Aboriginal women, in the back, and the following day things turned really nasty, and then two of the convicts were killed. Okay. Of course, the white fella's story was that this is these treacherous blacks who killed these people, and eventually Mosquito, the Sydney Aboriginal man, was one of them, and another Aboriginal man, and they were eventually captured and executed, hung for this particular event. And this is often regarded as the event that started the Black War. But other things at Great Swanport, because it wasn't really part of the project, I can't really help you there. Yes?
I just want to say what a sad and shameful story this is. And in terms of Robinson, why did they go with him? What was the reason? I'm sorry if I missed that.
Yeah. So the question is, why did these Aboriginal people, I'm assuming you're meaning his guides and envoys, why did they accompany Robinson? And that is a really good question. And it's a question people have wondered about always. Vivian Ray Ellis wrote a book, Truganini, Queen or Traitor, and saying, you know, they were traitors to their people. Vivian Ray Ellis, I don't think really quite got it right. I think that his guides, look, they've been living on the margins of white settlements for years, and they had seen the inexorable growth of people and taking over of country. And I think they understood that this was their only chance of survival. I think it's a survival thing. And as I said earlier, it gave them opportunity to be out there in country. They were safe. They didn't have to hide and, fear. They could have a fire. They didn't have to keep their fires small in case some stockkeepers saw them overnight and came and raided their camp at dawn, which was a very common way of going about things. So I think probably that they saw this basically as a survival for themselves and perhaps for the rest of their people. But we don't know. We really don't know.
Does any Aboriginal person here in Tasmania know? Has anyone given any, you know?
Not that I'm. So I was asked if it's any of the contemporary Aboriginal community, what their idea of that is, and no, people, no, I'm not aware of it. Robinson, of course, for the Aboriginal community is a very, very conflicted figure because they see Robinson as being betraying them, which in large parts he did in a way, betraying them and ending up being sent to Flinders Island where most people died. You had a question?
Yes, is this before or after the West Coast trip where you collected people off the West Coast?
So he was on the West Coast a couple of times. The first West Coast trip, he actually didn't really see many people at all. Saw a few. The second West Coast trip, which was after this, that was 1834. This is the one that James Boyce in his book talks about a lot, which he talks about the West Coast clearances, and which, the West Coast people at that stage there was no settlements anywhere near there. So, James Boyce regards that as being completely unnecessary, but that was after the Big River mission. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you going to go follow him up the West Coast?
Do you want to come with me, Ruth? Look, this one was always the one I thought was a really important one because it's the Big River was, But yes, I would love to follow. I mean, going up the West Coast, as you will know, is a very... So the question was, am I going to follow him up the West Coast? I should have said that before, on one of his West Coast journeys. And I've been on parts of the Tarkine coast where he was, and obviously been down the South Coast and Southwest Cape, and not doing this, and around the Strawn area and Sarah Island, which of course he took people to, where a lot of Aboriginal people died on Grummet Rock. I'd love to do it, but whether it will happen or not, to go from Macquarie Harbour, between Port Davey and Macquarie Harbour, is, for an old man like me, I have thought there's the Parks and Wildlife Service through Wildcare have volunteer weeding programs down that coastline. I think I might put my hand up for a couple of those and try and get parts of that coast so I can see parts of that coast. Yeah.
They can actually drive in a lot of it.
Yeah, from Birches.
And they do for those things.
Yeah.
So I think they get about halfway down to Port Davey.
Yeah.
There's a road from south of Hell's Gates.
Yes.
It's a very poor track.
Yes.
It's four-wheel drives when they go down.
Yeah.
And that's how they service the lights.
Yes. Yeah. Any more questions? Probably one or two more questions. Eleanor.
Thank you, Ian. Could you talk a bit about your experience working with the current landowners as you were moving through them?
So the question was, can I talk about my experience working with the current landholders on this project? Generally, it was incredibly good. So I'm, as Liz said at the beginning, I'm doing an exhibition in November and also doing a book of the photographs. I've got some essays in that book, a couple by myself. Greg Lehman is doing a foreword, and Rebecca Digney from the Aboriginal Land Council is writing an essay. And another essay is by Roderick O'Connor, who's the descendant of the original Roderick O'Connor, who was granted land on the Lake River in 1824. So of all the farmers I spoke to and rang up to see if I could go on their land, all except one were really helpful, very, very helpful. The one that wasn't is famously reclusive, and ends up. I said to Roderick one day, I said, Roderick, this guy here, you must know him. You're all interrelated, and you've all been, for 150 years. I didn't actually say that, but that's what I was thinking. And he said, oh yeah, he's my cousin. So he contacted him, and 10 minutes later, Roderick said, "You've got to ring him now. You've got to ring him now." So, and I had tried to telephone, I sent an email, I wrote a letter and sent text messages to this guy with no response. And I rang him straight away. So I only wanted to be on his land for about 3 or 4 kilometres, right on the very edge of his land. So I did sneak on it, just by a few hundred metres at both ends. But no, the farmers generally were really helpful, and they were interested, almost all very interested in the project. Had good experience with those farmers.
They tend to know the law, and the simple fact is the law is that as long as you're on anybody's land for a reasonable reason and are not doing any damage or anything like that, doesn't matter how many signs they put up, you're quite.
Well, there was one farmer who. This is the first day when I was taking photographs for this project, and I was on the side of the road and taking photographs, and this car pulled up, the ute pulled up, and the guy walked up to me and said, "Who are you? What are you doing?" And I told him about it, and he was really interested. And in fact, 18 months later, in the winter, I camped on his land for a couple of nights. But he also said to me, when I was talking about it, so I'm interested in history, so that's all right. I just worried that people will find butterflies here or something, and that he wouldn't be able to do what he wanted to do on his land. That's what his fear was. So always he was probably the cagiest of the farmers, and always, but he could also say, probably I need to diversify into a bit of tourism sometimes, so this could be useful for me, So yes, and farmers I offered photographs, like Roderick I gave half a dozen large photographs that I'd taken on his land. It was very respectful and was very, very, very good. Karen again.
Are they using any of the, I know Julian von Bibber is using old Aboriginal burning methods now. Are any other landowners? So
the question was, are any of the farmers using old Aboriginal land practices to manage their land? Look, there is a move amongst some farmers. Julian von Bibber, as you said, Roderick O'Connor, Peter Downey up at Dungrove, Tom Dunbabin when he was down at Bangor, the Camerons on, Roderick told me the Camerons on Kingston, John Batman's old property, do talk to Aboriginal communities, and they do try to learn from each other and give them access to land, and then use some of those traditional practices in land management. Yeah.
Tony, why the decision to do it all in black and white?
Because I like it. The question was why was I doing black and white? Look, I think it looks better. I think it works in this project. I like black and white photography, so it's pure self-indulgence. And I kind of, the historicisation is it kind of seemed appropriate to me. It certainly concentrates the mind when you're taking the photographs, because you need to be really aware of getting good graphic kind of, compositions. I'll let you all decide whether I succeeded or not at that. I've liked black and white photography. So yeah. Last question.
I read that one of the large properties is allowing Aboriginal people who've ancestors from that area onto the land. Is that happening with some of the other properties?
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, Roderick O'Connor, he lets people, people contact him. He's happy for them to come on their land. I think there'd be very few Aboriginal people alive in Tasmania now who would actually be able to give say that our mob were from that patch of dirt. People from the, most people would have descended from people in the northeast who are alive. So all this area, we don't know of anyone who's survived from those mobs in that central part of Tasmania or the southeast of Tasmania. Yeah. I think it's after 2 o'clock. I think we should probably call it a day. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.